The End of Oz, Chapter 11. Much to my relief, this time we weren't traveling by Wheeler. I had seen so many creepy things in Oz that it was surprising anything could still make my skin crawl, but I would be happy if I never saw those awful creatures again as long as I lived. Instead, Lang led us underground, down a twisting series of steps and tunnels that led into a huge torchlit cavern. At one end of the cave, a black stream flowed into a high-ceilinged tunnel. Nearer to us, it spread into a broad, shallow pool. A long dock stretched out into the water, and it led to it a black boat carved into the shape of a dragon. Jet black scales glimmered around its sides, and leathery black sails, shaped like wings, waved gently in the breeze, drifting off the river. Another many-headed beetle, dressed in a captain's uniform, complete with tiny sailor hats perched atop of its heads, jumped to attention as we approached. Lang led us onto the dock, and the captain helped each of us climb out and board. Madison refused his outstretched, segmented leg, with a shudder, muttering a curse under her breath as she whacked her shins on the edge of the boat. The beetle untied us from the dock, and the boat stretched its wings. Madison squeaked in surprise, and even Knox looked alarmed. "It's alive?" I exclaimed. "Of course she's alive," Lang said, looking at me in puzzlement. "How do you travel by water in the other place?" I thought about explaining that Kansas was landlocked and that we used cars, not dragons, but decided against it. Instead, I sank back into the bench carved onto the boat's hollow body. Except it wasn't carved, I realized. It was a smooth ridge of bone covered in leathery skin that was warm from the heat of the dragon's boat body. Peeking over the side, I saw huge, scaly legs paddling strongly underneath us. The captain controlled the dragon boat with a set of long leather reins. I tried not to think about how our boat's long, sharp, and very deadly-looking teeth. The river carried us through a seemingly endless series of dimly lit tunnels and underground canals. In places, we saw other traffic, mostly emaciated-looking peasants dressed in tattered rags, pulling along in skiffs, pieced together from bits and scraps, but also a few boats like ours, ferrying people who were obviously much richer. As we traveled, I told Knox and Lang about what Lorraine had showed me, and I couldn't be sure, but I almost sensed Lang softened as I talked, as if she was finally starting to believe that we might be on her side too. Each time we passed another boat, Lang gestured for us to duck down. The boat spread its wings even wider as we sailed past, hiding us under its huge wings. I was well aware of how important it was to stay hidden. Still, I couldn't help looking around every chance I got. The scenery was eerily beautiful and totally unlike anything I'd ever seen in Oz. Knox caught my eye and I leaned over to him. "Are you sure it was real?" he asked. "She's alive and they're winning." Knox leaned into my shoulder. "I hate her sometimes, most of the time, but I want her to be in the world so I can keep hating her until I can't anymore. Does that make sense?" I nodded. I could have said the same thing about my mother for most of my life. "But not now?" "She's better. She's trying. It doesn't erase the years when she was so messed up, and it doesn't mean it won't happen again, but I don't hate her today." The boat shifted suddenly, knocking me into him. Before I could right myself, Knox pulled me closer and kissed me. It wasn't like our other kisses. It was deeper and needier. I felt myself fall into it, blocking out our surroundings, if just for a moment. Next, Lang cleared her throat, and we broke apart. "We're getting close now. It's time for me to change." She turned away from us, and I saw the silver choker grow brightly for an instant. Lang faced us again, and I gasped. She now wore the face, or was it the head, of a homely old woman. Her clothes had been replaced by a nondescript coverall made of unremarkable gray-green fabric. She looked like a workman borrowing her boss's fancy boat to run an errand, which was exactly the point, I realized. Lang was turning out to be a master of disguise. "So some of the rumor is true," I said grimly. She shrugged. "I don't exactly kill people and take off their heads. With magic I'm able to borrow other people." Madison looked green, as though she might hurl over the side of the boat at any minute. "Does everyone in Ev live underground?" I asked, trying to change the subject. "Some of the farmers keep surface settlements," Lang said. I thought of the sad, shabby villagers we'd passed on the way to her palace. "Most people work as slave labor in the Gnome King's jewel mines and forges." "Slaves?" Knox asked. Lang gave him a sharp look. "We're not as enlightened here as you are in Oz," she said sarcastically. I thought of seeing the Munchkins mining for magic when I first landed in Oz. Dorothy's Oz isn't exactly what I'd call enlightened, I said. What about the Wheelers? I asked, grimacing at the memory of the awful creatures who'd so cavalierly bore us across the desert. They serve a purpose, she said. They keep people afraid of me. By terrorizing the farms around your palace? Nox asked dryly. She bristled. The Wheelers are the only creatures of Ev that are surface-bound. They're easy enough to escape in the underground tunnels. They never go below ground, and they make good guardians, if unpredictable ones. But they were ready to burn people's villages on the way, Madison said, and they wanted to hurt us. They know their place, Lang said curtly. They would never dare contradict my orders, and as for the villages... She shrugged. A few casualties are unavoidable in service to the larger cause. I learned that from the best, after all. She shot Nox a bitter look. Something like pain flashed across her face and was gone so fast I wondered if I'd seen it at all. I had to know their history, or it was going to drive me out of my mind, but I'd have to wait until I could talk to Nox alone. It was anyone's guess what it might be. Lang was matter-of-fact about the extreme poverty, which was obvious all around us, despite the beautifully carved tunnels decorated with jewel murals and elaborate dragon boats. I thought about Dusty Acres as we floated by the tiny structures that passed for homes along the river's banks. Injustice seemed like a way of life here. I wondered if Lang had always been so hardened to it, or if something had happened to her when she was part of the order that had made her into this ruthless, pragmatic double agent. Perhaps this was the point of all the different faces she wore. She didn't want to remain as one person. Anything I'd seen and done, all of the suffering I'd witnessed, starting with my very first hour in Oz, I thought I'd hardened myself to it. Just the way she had. That had become clear when I'd been explaining things to Madison earlier. I'd had to, or else I would have lost my mind. I'd had to fight to kill without regretting the death I left behind me. So did Nox, and ultimately so did Dorothy. But Dorothy had taken it a step further from the very beginning. She wasn't fighting injustice. She was creating it, ever since she returned to Oz. The first time she'd come to Oz, she'd been like me. She'd just tried to keep her friends and keep them safe, and when she'd come back, she'd killed and tortured people for fun. She made war into a hobby. She enslaved her subjects and warped them into her soldiers. Something had happened to make her that way. Something had turned her from a girl like me into the monster she'd become. Whatever that thing was, it was the key. I knew it. That was what I had to find out if I wanted to end her power forever without killing her. If I wanted to use compassion, but still win, I'd stop short of killing her directly. So I knew I was different. I felt like I had a dozen different strands of varying textures and lengths, and I almost ready to braid them together, but threads were still slipping through my fingers. There was something important I was missing, something about how all of this tied together, something that Lorraine had hinted at. The thing that bound to me to Dorothy and turned orphan kids like Nox and presumably Lang into battle-scarred warriors. If I could just undo the tangle and weave the threads together, but for now, the knots were too dense for me to unravel. And I realized I didn't want to defeat Dorothy because it was my mission. I wanted to defeat her because I wanted to stay alive. I wanted to see my mom again. I wanted to have a chance at a real life with Nox, a relationship that wasn't constantly thrown into turmoil by war and intrigue. I wanted to make sure that Madison got home safely to her family and to her kid. I had responsibilities that were bigger than me, bigger than the Order and what they wanted for me. I had a family. I had friends. The dragon boat slowed down and I stopped thinking. For now, we just had to stay alive. I would figure out the next step when we were safe. As soon as you get in Ev anyway, which didn't seem very safe at all. My lady, we're here, the captain said, several of his mouths speaking at once. His eerie, rustling voices broke the silence. Good, Lang said, her voice flat and distant. You know the way in. Take us home. The dragon boat stilled in the fast-moving water, its legs moving powerfully against the current to hold us in place. The captain held up long, segmented limbs and began to chant in a low, haunting sing-song. Each of its mouths shaped different words and different melodies, the individual songs weaving together into a tapestry of sound that sent a chill down my spine. The music was full of pain and longing, and somehow, even though I didn't understand any of the words, I knew all of them were sad. Was there anything in Ev that wasn't about heartbreak and loss? As the boatman continued his song, a fissure appeared in the rock face in front of us. Slowly the boat moved toward it, and the chant increased in intensity. The fissure widened just enough for us to slip through, and then the rock slammed closed behind us, and the boat song trailed off into a sudden silence. The darkness was so intense it seemed almost alive. Suddenly I could feel the tons of rock above us, and the distance between us and the open sky. I swallowed hard, trying to ease the suffocating feeling that was taking over me. Breathe, I told myself firmly. Just breathe. The ceiling isn't collapsing. The stone isn't moving. You're fine. It takes some getting used to, Lang said in the darkness beside me. I jumped. She almost sounded sympathetic. There was a crack and a hiss, and the boatman was lighting a lantern with a match. The light barely made a dent in the smothering darkness around us, but at least I could see something now. We were in a low, narrow tunnel, a rock just inches above our heads. The boat's wings were furled tightly to its sides now, and its head was lowered close to the water to avoid brushing the tunnel roof. I think I liked it better when it was dark, Madison said. Even in this dim light, I could see that she was pale. I hated it at first, too, Lang said as the boat moved forward again. It's funny how much a person can change. Now, when I go above ground, I feel naked. It'd take years up there to get used to it again. Knox was looking a little pale, too. I reached over and squeezed his hand, and he gave me a brief, grateful glance. Lang saw the touch and frowned, looking away again. We're almost there, she said. Just a few more minutes. What was that song? I asked the boatman, but he didn't respond. He only speaks to me, Lang said. It's a spell that all my servants know. It can only be sung by a single person with many voices. It's the only way to get to this place I'm taking you. Why'd you set the magic up that way? Madison asked. Lang was silent, and Knox answered her. So no one can torture it out of her, he said. I'm guessing her servants don't feel pain. After that, none of us felt like talking for a while. Finally, the tunnel opened up into a larger cavern where the water formed a broad, flat lake that was big enough for the lantern light didn't reach to its shore. I felt my spirits lift as the ceiling did, as if the rock itself had been oppressing us. The dragon boat sped up, probably sensing it was nearly at the end of its journey, and soon the lamplight fell into a narrow pebbled beach. Lang kicked off her shoes. In one smooth motion, she swung herself over the boat's side and into the water, wading toward shore. I guess we follow, Knox said under his breath. I climbed out of the boat as Knox offered Madison a hand. She waved it away. The pitch-black water was almost hip-deep and freezing cold. I splashed my way toward the beach, and something very large and very scaly slithered past my calves. Panic flooded through me, and I half ran, half sloshed towards the shore. Madison made an awful noise behind me, and I knew what she'd just encountered. Whatever it was had just passed me. They're harmless, Lang called from the beach. I didn't stay in the water long enough to find out whether or not she was telling the truth, and Knox and Madison were right behind me. You can change, Lang said, indicating our soaked clothes with a jerk of her head. She unearthed a waterproof leather bag of supplies from somewhere, and was pulling on tight black leather leggings, a loose shirt, and boots. With her dark hair pulled back from her face in a high ponytail, she looked like a cross between a rocker and an aerobics instructor. I rummaged through the bag, choosing a similar outfit. My shoes had stayed miraculously dry despite the slog to shore. Apparently magic boots were water-resistant. Who knew? Knox changed with his back to us, his lean muscles rippling as he pulled on a clean shirt. You're staring, Madison said, elbowing me in the ribs. I am not, I said, blushing. Mm-hmm, she said, and rolling her eyes. Behind us, the dragon boat was paddling away, steering by its strange captain. Lang lit another lantern, its flickering amber light playing over the rocky beach and setting looming sinister shadows ahead of us. Come on, she said. You can rest for now a few hours before we figure out what to do next. I have enough alarm spells to set up to wake the dead, but we shouldn't need them for a while. No one but me knows this place exists. Rest. Just the word sent a flood of longing through me. When was the last time I'd really been able to rest? I thought of the little bedroom my mom had set up for me in Kansas while she waited for me to come home, even though everything pointed to the fact that I was dead. How she refused to give up on me. Gotten sober in case I came back, finally started dating someone who wasn't a greaseball or a loser. I plodded over Lang's wobbly beacon. across the stone beach and onto yet another tunnel. This one was more rough-hewn than anything in her palace. Thankfully, it also didn't sport the headless horseman themed decor. There were fewer branches and turnings. It was as if Lang was leading us deeper into the heart of the earth itself. We were silent, our breath echoing in the dimly lit narrow tunnel. For the millionth time, I wondered what my mom was doing now. It wasn't just me who'd vanished this time. The Gnome King's magic had destroyed the high school and pulled Madison into Oz too. We were both missing persons. Me for the second time. I wanted to believe my mom would be okay, but I knew better. She'd barely been sober for a month when I disappeared a second time. She'd lost our home, me, everything, even her pet rat Star. Her new boyfriend Jake seemed like a nice enough guy, but I wondered how good he'd be at helping her stay sober, or if she'll fall back on her old bad habits. She'd been right to hope that I was alive for the first time I disappeared, but I couldn't imagine what she'd be able to keep up hope a second time. And even if we finally defeated Dorothy and I found a way to get back to Kansas, I wasn't sure I wanted to go. "You look really sad," Madison said quietly. I jumped. "Yeah, sorry," I said. "I was just thinking about—" "Kansas?" she supplied. "Yeah, are you trying not to think about it?" "Yeah," she said. "I just keep going over that moment in my head, when Assistant Principal Scranton turned into the freaky-ass dude and dragged me through whatever that was. And I dropped Dustin Jr. I dropped him, my kid." She shook her head. "I can't stop wondering if there's something I could have done different. What mistake I made to end up here without him. I don't belong here, Ames, and I don't want to be here, and now everything is... This all seems just like some awful, fucked-up dream." "I know," I said. I did know was the thing. I knew what she was going through in a way that no one else in Oz probably could. Lang and Knox might have lost their parents, but they were still living in the place where they were from. They hadn't literally been pulled out of their own world and into one that they've grown up believing was just a story. A funny movie with cheesy old actors and bad face paint and a pretty girl in a checkered dress.